Students, what's the most messed up thing you've witnessed a teacher saying or doing to another student? Our English teacher at that time, Mrs. Butkus, was very strict, almost authoritarian. Any student who failed her class would be called to the office and reprimanded in front of all the other teachers. There was this one specific student in our class, Farton McGee, who did very poorly in English. Truth be told, I think Farton's grade was average, just like everyone else's. But Mrs. Butkus hated Farton. In recitation, essays, reports, quizzes, etc., Farton always came last. Then Farton was always called to the office, and Mrs. Butkus even used Farton as a negative example for students in our year. Mrs. Butkus's disdain for Farton was evident from the very beginning of the school year. On the first day of class, she had everyone introduce themselves and share something they liked. When it was Farton's turn, he nervously mentioned that he liked drawing and playing video games. Mrs. Butkus scoffed, "Drawing and video games? Well, no wonder you struggle in my class. Those activities don't exactly scream intellectual." Every time Farton raised his hand to participate, Mrs. Butkus would either ignore him or belittle his answers. During one recitation, Farton answered a question correctly, but instead of acknowledging it, Mrs. Butkus sneered and said, "Even a broken clock is right twice a day." The whole class laughed, and Farton shrank back into his seat, his face red with embarrassment. One day, we had to submit an essay on a topic of our choice. Farton, who was passionate about his hobbies, wrote a detailed essay about the art of video game design, including its history and impact on modern entertainment. When Mrs. Butkus handed back the graded essays, Farton's was covered in red ink. She had written comments like, "This is irrelevant and waste of time," all over the pages. She had given him an F with a note that read, "This is why you fail. Focus on real subjects." The ridicule didn't stop in the classroom. During a school assembly where achievements were being recognized, Mrs. Butkus took the opportunity to single out Farton once again. She said, "While many of our students have excelled in various subjects, there are some who are content with mediocrity. Farton McGee, for instance, would rather draw cartoons than put in the effort to improve his grades." The entire assembly burst into laughter, and Farton, sitting in the back row, wished he could disappear. The culmination of Mrs. Butkus's campaign against Farton happened during a parents' meeting a week before our final exam. All of our subject teachers were invited to tell the parents about the class progress. Mrs. Butkus was the last teacher to speak. She started on about how we were excellent students, quick learners, blah blah blah. Then she mentioned Farton. Despite all of the students' excellence, there is this one student who spoils the good porridge. Farton is always last in our exams and other graded activities. I have done my best in teaching Farton, yet he doesn't learn a thing. To Farton's mother, I suggest you enroll him in a special class so we can gauge his learning ability, and please supervise him. Because I believe that your irresponsibility is also at fault for his poor grades. To all students, do not follow Farton's footsteps, and to parents, we must be responsible for our children. The worst part was after her speech. Some of my classmates laughed so hard somebody even fell down. Farton's mother cried right then and there. She dragged Farton home, and after that Farton dropped out of school. Even now, I still can't believe she had the face to say that crap. After that meeting, the atmosphere in the class changed. Some students, emboldened by Mrs. Butkus's treatment of Farton, started bullying him more openly. They would trip him in the hallways, knock his books out of his hands, and write nasty notes on his desk. Farton tried to ignore it, but it was clear he was struggling. He became quieter and more withdrawn, no longer participating in class or drawing in his notebook. One day, during lunch, a group of students cornered Farton and started taunting him about his grades and his hobbies. One of them grabbed his sketchbook and started tearing out the pages, scattering his drawings all over the cafeteria. Farton stood there, helpless, as the bullies laughed and mocked him. Mrs. Butkus was nearby, but she did nothing to stop it. In fact, she seemed to be enjoying the spectacle. The final straw came a few days later. Farton had been working on a project for another class, something he was genuinely excited about. It was a diorama of a scene from one of his favorite video games, meticulously crafted and detailed. He brought it to school to show his teacher, hoping for some positive feedback. But Mrs. Butkus saw it, and in front of the whole class, she smashed it on the floor. "This is what you waste your time on?" she yelled. "No wonder you're failing." Farton didn't come to school the next day, or the day after that. Rumors started to spread that he had dropped out, and eventually we found out it was true. Farton's mother had pulled him out of school and was considering homeschooling him. The news hit some of us hard. Even those who had laughed at him felt a pang of guilt. We had let Mrs. Butkus's cruelty go unchecked, and now Farton was paying the price.